Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Fallen London. Today we're going to be having a look at a new serial story in Fallen London called Evolution. Only the first part is out. Well, I think the second part is out as I am recording this, but it's going to be coming out in stages over the next year or so this will be a slow series. But if you like what you see here, please like and subscribe to the channel because we do more Fallen London things, mainly exceptional stories, and there's some Sunless Seas in there somewhere. And there's also a coffee link somewhere if you want to support me more directly. But we're going to jump in. We have a message from the Dillman Club. The note left in your postbox doesn't try to convince you. It simply says, Orchard House, meet us today. Well, let's go visit Orchard House. It has been some time since the Dillman Club gained access to the Banded Prince's domain. Have they made a breakthrough? This is a smaller gathering of the club. No sign of the discreet Sybarite, the woman in green, or many other members. Only Fiduci, his amused lordship, and the implacable detective, and the Bishop of St. Fiacres are in attendance. And you. A map of the Elder Continent has been splayed out on the table. 77 red dots, marking the kingdoms of the Presbyterate. Well, let's let the implacable detective finish speaking. You've been let in as she is mid-sentence. Contact with the Banded Prince has opened doors for us on the continent, she says, pointing at the map. Silver pins sporting little flags have been stuck next to a few red dots, fanning out from the Banded Prince's domain near Port Carnelian. New avenues of investigation, new leads to pursue, dozens. And yet, asps Fiduci, progress remains terribly lethargic. Every kingdom of the Presbyterate contains only fragments of knowledge, and each boasts its own flavour of impediment to obtaining that knowledge. Well, we can cough politely. Perhaps you should let them know that you are here. His amused lordship smiles jovially. He glances in your direction to acknowledge your presence, but doesn't pause his own argument. We are closer today than yesterday. Perhaps tomorrow we will be closer still. We haven't hit a wall yet. Fiduci scoffs. The Hussite texts we recovered turned out to be forgeries, and our informant in Vestia has disappeared entirely. Every time we dig out a seam of information, circumstances align to bury it again. The detective nods. Yes, the gatekeepers of the garden are finally moving against us, subtle though they may be. Let's take a seat. A pointed social gambit. Perhaps you don't need to be acknowledged. The Bishop of St. Fiacres takes no notice of your approach. The mountain must always remain our primary focus, but there are other questions to answer on the matter of death. Physiological, etiological, perhaps even theological. His amused lordship swirls his wine a little, glancing sideways at the bishop. Fiduci thinks your other questions are distractions, a waste of our resources. His tone suggests that he's leaving the door open to agreeing with either side. Well, we can interrupt them. They've been at this for some time. What do they want with you, specifically? 8 eyes turn towards you. Right, we're getting to that, says Bishop of St. Fiacres. We have a rare opportunity to obtain physical evidence of the persistence of the self. Not the soul per se, but other components that also shape identity and consciousness. The things, his lordship adds, that any worthwhile pursuit of immortality would preserve. A soul in a jar is not so much immortal as it is non-perishable. The bishop points to a pushpin on the map next to a cautiously circular bay. The Citadel of Klein, one of the 77 kingdoms of the Presbyterate. The evidence is there. We simply need someone trustworthy to extract it. Okay, let's get some details. Someone trustworthy, you presume? The Bishop of St. Fiacres is businesslike. Board your ship, make contact with our friend in Klein, obtain the evidence, come back without delay. What exactly is this evidence supposed to be? It ought to resemble a snail's shell, explains Fiducci. Very old, very pale, calcified, but its true composition isn't easy to describe. Travelling ourselves is out of the question, and further discussion would simply be conjecture, says the implacable detective. As your sponsor, I petition for you to make this voyage. Go, see Klein with your own eyes, bring the shell back to us. Then we can take our leave. His amused lordship smiles at you encouragingly. There's a sense of urgency as the Dillman Club's visionaries usher you out of Orchard House and onto the cold, smoggy street. You're left with some written instructions, a cryptic address in the Kingdom of Klein, the name of the bishop's supposed contact, and a few Z-charts of questionable reliability. There's undoubtedly a lot that the Dillman Club isn't telling you. Perhaps you can learn some of it yourself. You may chart a course to Klein from your ship. So, our ship is at Wolfstack Docks. Now, I do have to admit, the amount of time I've spent at Z is minimal, but I have done it before. I think last time I died rather spectacularly, so let's put to Z on the ship. Into the captain's cabin to chart a course and sail. The maps, treacherous as they are laid out before you. Ah, here we go. There's a special card up here. Travel to the Kingdom of Klein, a seldom visited port on the coast of the Elder Continent. Klein is one of the Presperate's more isolated kingdoms. Little is known about it in London. Let's chart a course, a careful path laid around the treacherous rocks and sandbanks of the continent. Oh, once you arrive, you will not be able to leave until you have completed your task. Klein is located next to a deep, circular bay on the edge of the Elder Continent. The mouth of the bay is narrow, and by all reports, shallow. Your pilot will need to pay close attention. So, we now have two options to chart a course. We can either trace a route along Z currents or rethink our plans. So we're going to trace a route. The Z has little in the way of winds or waves, but it does have currents. It's easier to sail around the Z's dangerous centre in roughly anti-clockwise direction. This will take you from home waters to Shepherd's Wash. Now, anyone who has watched my Sunless Seas series should see a lot of similar things here. Spray kicks up from the stale water of the Z as your ship begins moving. Home waters, the waters closest to London, though only relatively safe, are still relatively safe. Full steam ahead. The crew is in good spirits, relatively. Okay, and now I believe we have to draw cards to travel along here. And we are currently out to Z. So we can either, she's going down, on the horizon you glimpse the last moments of a dying steamer. She's blazing like a Viking funeral, her bow rising higher by the second above red-lit black waters. A handful of crew members have put to Z in lifeboats. We have to rescue them. As much as we could just let the Untersea have them, it is nothing less than your duty to save them. The sailors are burnt, shivering and half-crazed with fear. They've learned a valuable lesson in engine maintenance. We're behind schedule, but that's a small price to pay. Oh, a steamer full of passengers? An enormous ship passes on the starboard bow. It's a cruise vessel, sometimes used by the extremely rich and scandalous to journey and party away their time in exile. Let's just zoom past them since I have nothing else to do. A merry blast from the whistle, and you're on your way. The cruiser's smokestacks disappear over the horizon, inch by inch. The waft of French perfume and wine stays with you all day. Oh, a corvette of Her Majesty's Navy. A swift corvette of the Royal Navy steams out of nowhere and draws up alongside you. We can exchange pleasantries via semaphore. Let's see what her captain has to say. I believe that's because our scandal wasn't too bad. If our scandal's too bad, they get a little upset. M-O-N-S-T. Oh, how sweet. The corvette's captain is signalling over a list of local hazards and details of his vessel's recent course. Pay attention and you should be able to avoid a great deal of trouble. Huzzah for the Navy! A navigation error? Uh-oh. The Z is treacherous. Maps of the Z? Doubly so. The motions of the false stars disagree with your dead reckoning. You are not where you thought you were. So, we can either correct our course, make new calculations and observe the false stars, which we would have 100% to do. We can listen to the Z. A seasoned sailor can always tell I am not a seasoned sailor. Or we can consider what we learned from the starved men in that exceptional story. You have a false star chart of exceeding detail and precision to aid you. Written Glim, exceptional friend story? We may as well. What false star charts, at least ones made on the floor of the Neath, don't reveal is the motives behind the false star's motions. The starved men themselves have only lightly pierced this question, but it still leads unusual accuracy of their reckoning. They know the true seasons of the false star's motions, their needs and their dramas as they play out on the ceiling. We gained 13 map scraps. You're making good time into the next leg of your trip, approaching Shepherd's Wash, Z-Beasts and Martial Nuns, and further south, the Carnelian coast, and that's where we're heading. Did something slither in the water? Are those birds flitting in the distance? The fabled blue prophets, which anyone who's watched My Son the Seas knows I hate. Shepherd's Wash is a place of monsters. It is also the closest part to the Z to the mountain's light. The waters are choppy and tinged with blooms of green and brown algae. We're still on relatively safe waters, nothing too nasty should be here. What do the drownies sing? A song rises from the calm waters. The eerie singing of the drownies is known to lure men to their doom. One sailor is already leaning over the parapet. We can either keep the crew from listening, speak over the song, convince them to pay it no mind, shove wax into their ears if you must. Or we can drown out the drownies. They can't hear them singing if the engines are roaring. Or we can cure the ignorance of your sailors. Drowny illusions can be dispelled given the proper rites, and with suitable ingredients. So, a 50% chance to use my cataleptic toxicology? Let's flip the coin, let's see what happens. We succeeded! You supply the crew with a chemical antidote, and a rhetorical one, teaching them to see through the illusions. That song rising from the waters is not quite so sweet if you listen to the words right. Those pleading eyes beneath the water are just blind fish coming up to the surface, reflecting the false star's light. There is nothing to fear here, and surely nothing to love. Okay, the wax wind, it looks like a low-lying storm cloud in the distance, until you can discern the milky yellow colour. Wax wind! Screams one of your sailors. So we can either shut off the engines and hide below decks. We'll make no progress for a moment, but this is the safe option. We can sail into the wind. The ship's rudder must be struck to a certain position so that the crew can safely hide below decks. Or if we had a submarine, which I do not, we could have dived beneath the waters, but let's sail into the wind. Engines to 3/4, lash the wheel! The ship's direction and speed must be carefully calculated so that you stay on course during the storm. With your careful guidance, he follows the line you hastily traced on a map without too much error. Soon, you emerge from below decks a little further along your journey. Globs of yellow wax, battered into sharp splatters by the violent storm, cover the hull and decks. We gained a Z-story. We also gained why is it so bright in here all of a sudden, which does kind of worry me a little bit. Arriving at port, at last! the sight of land and relative safety. The Kingdom of Klein. There, the coastline breaks into a narrow mouth leading into a circular bay. The bay looks curiously like a perfect circle on maps. Its nature is clearer in person. Klein is built beside an enormous crater, perhaps carved out of the elder continent by a vast and plummeting stalactite, or by a truly colossal glimfall. The kingdom itself is a citadel perched over the raised lip of the crater, a circular wall of limestone reflecting the light of the mountain. The bay, in turn, reflects the citadel, its white cone mirrored in the still water like the ghost of that ancient Spiliothem. There's not much of a port. A few jetties stick out into the bay, largely empty. The helmsman has no trouble bringing your ship into a moor. Most trade must come through an inland route, or perhaps the inhabitants have little need for imported goods. And here we are. The gates of Klein. A citadel ringed in white limestone stands at the edge of a dark bay. From the harbour, a trail winds its way into the city through a small gatehouse. 2 bored guards are checking safe conducts and other documentation. We can present our travel papers from the Minister of Culture. An innocuous cover story will serve you well. Klein is a strayed, stoic society. Its inhabitants dressed plainly in white, its architecture squat and squarish. But you have a signed document claiming you are a cultural envoy to the kingdom, sent by the banded prince's court to study the city's artistic heritage. The guards, leaning on outmodded muskets, take a long time to consider whether you may be lying, and to weigh the consequences of taking a liar at their word against the consequences of dismissing an envoy of the banded prince. Eventually, they let you pass. We can either wander the streets, or we can be in the Citadel's shadow. Let's wander the streets. Orderly, geometric buildings line the straight and narrow streets. Their timber frames and drab colours resemble an architect's model, scaled up to full size without regard for ornamentation. Many citizens seem to shuffle as if burdened by some heavy weight. They hunch forward, walking with stiff joints and awkward postures. You were given an address. Now you just have to find it. We can either ask for directions. One mustn't be too proud to request help. We can find our way. All the streets are set at right angles to one another. How hard can it be? Or we can covertly follow the locals. Why are they moving so slowly? Perhaps you'll learn more if you shadow them. I'm going to covertly follow the locals. 66% chance to pass because of my horrific shadow skill. But we succeeded. A great many citizens are walking circuitous paths. You follow them at a distance, unobserved, as they go through identical motions like automatons around a clock. Their gestures are not only sluggish, they follow similar patterns, as though they were actors performing rehearsed parts. One stooped woman trips on an uneven step. She murmurs a protective prayer. She walks back and forth, retreading her route, until she can complete the circuit with no deviation. Let's wander the streets again and ask for directions this time. In London, it's easy to engage a pedestrian to get your bearings. More often than not, Londoners will happily offer directions that are precise, thoughtfully considered, and wrong. The locals here are more reluctant to answer questions. They hedge their responses or reply in generalities. Language barrier or no, you can tell when someone is essentially saying, "Sorry, I'd rather not get tangled up in a stranger's business." Still, you are able to plead your way to a few clues about where you're supposed to be heading. Well, we can find our own way now. Let's see what happens here. All the streets are set at right angles to one another. How hard can it be? There are subtleties to the Citadel's layout that would confound any visitor. The near identical buildings don't help you orient yourself either. but after wearing down a couple millimeters of shoe leather, you start constructing a mental map. Klein isn't arranged in a grid, but in vast, square spirals, each one a tamed earthen hill. As you spiral inwards, the terrain slopes up. That realization, plus the blinding mountain on the horizon, is enough to give you some sense of direction. Is this the correct address? Oh, have I found it? A meeting in a white parlour. The house is unremarkable amongst its fellows. Its square frame is flush with other buildings on the street, like another tooth crammed into a crowded mouth. But the vague directions you received from the Dillman Club seem to match its location. And there, on the windowsill, a stone carved in the shape of an apple. Oh, let's knock on the door. You are expected. You are ushered into a spacious room, where the furnishings are sparse. A table covered in a white cloth stands alone in the centre. Your host is a man of undefinable age. Like most citizens of the Presbyterian, he could be 30 or 300. His sluggish reactions and tired appearance, however, suggest he's on the older end. His body is shrouded in a white sheet. On the table are two things: a shell, calcified, white, large as a man's head, spiraling like a snail, and a knife, long, thin, serrated, sharp. Inside the house, you can still see the timbers that frame the building, visible at the edges of the pale plaster walls. Scratches on the wooden floor indicate that the room wasn't always so empty. The other furniture must have been dragged away hastily. Only the long table with the white cloth remains. On it, the calcified shell you came here to obtain, and conspicuously, a knife. Let's speak with the Shrouded Man. He is the friend the Bishop of St. Fiacres mentioned.
You shouldn't stay long. They are often watching.
His voice is measured, didactic, monotone. He speaks with the cadence of someone accustomed to paying a high price for talking out of turn. This is what you seek, he says, gesturing towards the shell on the table. It belonged to an uncle who died long ago, but before you take it, I have a favour to ask. If I'm right about your intent, then I have a fresher specimen that may serve your research better. However, you must choose. I could be punished severely for giving you one. I cannot risk the penalty for two. We can inquire about this fresher specimen, and where, pray tell, would such a thing come from? By way of explanation, the Shrouded Man faces away from you and lets the sheet around his body drop below his shoulders. A spiral shell protrudes from the base of his neck, like a snail mounted in a museum. It twists counterclockwise, flat against his back. Unlike the one on the table, this shell looks glossy, more vibrant, alive. Everyone in Klein must have one, some larger than others. That would explain their stiff movements and hunched postures. You will need to perform the extraction yourself, he adds. So that explains the knife. Okay, we can look for fresh shell's attachment point. You haven't seen any anatomical feature quite like this before. Ask why he wants the shell removed. Is it burdensome, harmful to his body? Take the white shell on the table. This is what the Dillman Club requested. They didn't mention surgery. Or we can take the knife and cut. Seems feasible, if not the simplest operation in the world. It's a bit sad that it uses my shadowy ability, huh? My weakest one. Let's ask why he wants the shell removed. The shell ties me to this city, marks me as her citizen. I would prefer to go elsewhere. He does not elaborate. Okay, let's look for attachment points. Though the shell nestles tightly against the flesh on his back, it attaches only where the spiral starts, just above his ribcage, right below his neck. Surgical removal doesn't seem impossible, but it's hard to predict the long-term effects. or the short-term effects for that matter. It is an accumulation of regret, the burden of making choices every day. It grows with one's mistakes. He sounds as if he is explaining to a child. The law of the Presbyterate is clear. None shall live 1,000 years, but some lives are heavier than others. A 44% chance to cut it off, and it does intrigue me. Let's spend a hastily scrawled warning note to see if we can do this. We failed. Let's try again. We succeeded. You don't start with a knife. First, your fingers find the exact attachment point. In truth, the shell extrudes from somewhere deep between the vertebrae. It would be impossible to remove at the root without decapitating the patient, but you can cut the shell itself, carefully slicing away near the bone. It will grow again, says the Shrouded Man. Already, I feel new regret, but it will take time. By then, I should be gone. You should be gone soon as well. After stitching the wound, you leave him to recuperate. Luckily, the locals are too burdened by their own regrets to inspect the cloth bundle under your arm. As you return to the harbour, the mountain's light beats on your back with an unfriendly warmth. Before I leave, let's have a look in the Citadel's shadow. Towering at the kingdom's centre, the Citadel rises to vertiginous height. Even craning your neck all the way, it's difficult to see the distant spire at the top. Incense thickens the air at the Citadel's base, where countless market stalls have accumulated, like barnacles stuck to a boat. Despite their commercial function, the stalls seem more like shrines. Let's approach the Citadel and see what happens. Armed sentinels surround the tower on every side. Like the guards at the city gate, these sentinels are armed with obsolete weapons, ancient muskets, blunt bayonets, rust-covered scimitars. They must rarely engage in combat, but through sheer numbers alone they could repulse a regiment. They hunch forward, balancing on spears and blades like canes, encased in bulbous breastplates. As you draw nearer, you realize the Citadel is encircled with salt, lines and lines that have been poured across the ground. You step over the first line, and those obsolete weapons seem less obsolete when the sentinels raise them. That's as close as you're going to get. We got 17 flasks of abominable salt. Let's have a look at these stalls. What goods are the citizens purchasing here? Klein's residents must have an insatiable need for good luck. Every stall is stocked with charms and talismans. Some are small enough to tuck into a pocket, others could be worn as heavy necklaces, and some are so large that they'd have to be arranged like furniture in someone's house. Stone slabs chiseled with wards against misfortune, statues inscribed with blessings, prayer wheels with spinning mantras. Only currency from the kingdom is accepted as payment. You have none yourself, but you glimpse a few coins trading hands. Each coin is stamped with a spiral pattern. We gain 20 Maniac's Prayers. Let's depart, Klein. You have spent more than enough time in this city. Are the residents watching you? They seem to be going about their business, moving slowly and deliberately through the streets without giving you a second thought. Best to keep it that way. Let's set sail back to London. Before leaving, explore everything you wish. Who knows when you'll be able to return? I have looked at everything. When you first arrived, the city's walls looked like indifferent limestone, piled in chunks like an earthwork. As you pass through them a second time, you recognize the building material. Calcified shells. Millions are heaped in a ring-shaped pile around the Citadel, with the uppermost inexorably crushing the shells at the bottom into dust. Your ship is a welcome sight. Not long after you leave the bay for the open sea, however, your bosun knocks at your cabin door.
Captain, we have a stowaway in the hold. You might want to come talk to him.
M. Demue's advice for captains encourages seafarers to post a lookout at the gangway while docked in port, but said lookout shouldn't be too attentive. The higher grade of stowaway, recently retired urchin gang lieutenants, are a critical resource. Pressing a longshanks into service has saved many an undermanned vessel in dangerous waters. It is, therefore, all the more disappointing to find that your stowaway is 6'2", decidedly grown up, and halfway through making a sandwich from one of your ship's lovingly procured tins of preserved eels. Let's get his attention. Thus far, he's still foraging, oblivious that he's been caught. He must have snuck aboard while you were docked at Klein, but he's clearly a Londoner. If his clothes didn't give him away, his face is vaguely familiar. Have you met him at the university? He looks a little young to be a lecturer, but too old to be a student. "Captain," he says, pivoting to face you. "Just who I wanted to see. I was hoping we could discuss my stay in your vessel." He doesn't look like he was hoping to do anything more than sample your ship's preserved seafood. He steps closer. Now you recognize him. A youthful naturalist from Benthic College. His expertise? Jellyfish. You haven't spoken before, but he has a reputation for dangerous theories that belay his placid academic field. "I should apologize for meeting you like this, but I'd been waiting for a London vessel and I couldn't risk being stranded any longer." He awkwardly sets down his sandwich, wiping crumbs from his fingers. "I can pay for my passage back to London." So we can either invite him up for dinner, well, if he can pay, and perhaps he'll provide some diversion for the voyage, or we can just throw him overboard. No mercy for stowaways, especially fully grown ones. This will skip a conversation with the youthful naturalist, but his story will continue. We will invite him up for dinner. "Splendid," he says, clapping you on the back. He drops his payment into your palm. Maybe you should have discussed the amount first. But he is lively company. You sit together in your cabin, dining on freshly caught fish. "Less vinegary than the tin stuff," he says, forking it into his mouth with relish. He is filled with anecdotes about the Untersee, about the university, about Klein and its people. When he notices your shell of regret, he whistles. "You actually smuggled one out, and they didn't, well, you know." He pretends to drag his knife across his throat. "Very impressive. Might I have a look?" As you dine together, a lamp sways overhead in your cabin, rocking with the vessel. The youthful naturalist really is a knowledgeable fellow. He can explain complex scientific hypotheses with a light touch, which is a necessary skill when one requires funding. He's learned that donors prefer simple terms. Of course, funds are still rarely forthcoming. He's accustomed to taking his research into his own hands. We can show him the living shell of regret. We have similar interests. I was inclined to study these shells too. He produces a little notebook. "Managed to map a few patterns," he says. Then he traces his finger along the shell, comparing each whorl to a diagram in the notebook. "Let's see here. Misplaced trust. Disappointment in love, which is always a popular one. Unsatisfied ambition. Satisfied ambition. Sometimes you can't win, can you? And I see some smaller regrets. This looks like hair loss or hives. Hard to tell. My notes are still incomplete." He hands the shell back to you. Pretty sad life, all things considered. Barely even worth preserving. "I'm interested in longevity, you see. Some organisms are biologically encoded to survive longer. If that's how they're encoded," says the youthful naturalist, gesturing towards the shell again with his fork, "then an extended life might be a bumpy ride. Those worlds record the past, but their patterns also lay groundwork for the future. Hard to change course when your body is physically built a certain way, wouldn't you say?" So we can either agree with his point of view, for better or worse, the biological world imposes limits on everybody. We can disagree with the youthful naturalist. Change is always possible. Natural law can be bent underneath, or broken. Or we can question the youthful naturalist's premise. Even if an organism is designed a certain way, you might not grasp its design. I'm going to disagree. I believe change is always possible. I hoped you'd disagree, says the youthful naturalist with a grin like a schoolboy who's just pulled a prank. My research has led me to some curious observations myself. Unsavoury according to some people, but it's always the same with academics. Talk, talk, talk until it's time to get your hands dirty. That's when you learn that the real limits are intellectual. Some scholars have no imagination. He looks down at his plate. Speaking of preserving things, I wouldn't mind some more tinned eel. Nothing against fresh fish, but I do enjoy a vinegary bite. Don't you? An unremarkable voyage on the Undersea is rather remarkable. You make good time back to London. The youthful naturalist snores most of the way, rocking in a hammock. You take the opportunity to sketch your shell of regret, transcribe its dimensions, scrape samples, and analyze the spiraling patterns. When you hold it to your ear, you can hear something like the ocean, if the ocean could whisper to you. Let's dock at Wolfstack Docks, London. The gaslights of Wolfstack Dock will bring you to a safe berth. Ah, home again, says the youthful naturalist. He stands at the gangplank with both hands on his hips, inhaling the cold, thickened fog. Now I remember why I wanted to leave. But he thanks you again for the return passage. Time for the rounds, I suppose. Got favours to call in, debts to dodge, and articles to publish. If anyone will have them. That's the trouble with academia. So much knowledge, so little interest. Oh, and do me a favour, will you? He asks, turning back before stepping into the crowd. Tell the Dillman Club I said hello. Okay, let's report to the Dillman Club. This time, you convene the meeting. It is therefore your dubious privilege to accommodate the Dillman Club at your lodgings. You must employ sufficiently discreet servants, stock your sideboard with the better years, and provide those little fungal canapes that his amused lordship enjoys so much, even if he declines to eat them, lamenting dietary restrictions imposed by the most damnably inconvenient gout. Alright, let's present our findings to the club. When everyone is gathered, you command the servants to draw the curtains. I didn't even realise I had servants, but hey-ho. Not all the club members are present. Amongst themselves, they must have agreed upon which members could risk attendance to a meeting with a relic from the elder continent in the room. His amused lordship and the Bishop of St. Fiacres chat amicably, as if this were simply a normal meeting. But Fiduci rests one hand on his sword's hilt. An unlikely florist has brought along a bottle with a nozzle, which he keeps within easy reach. The implacable detective watches you with a fixed gaze, while the woman in green records the minutes. Let's deliver the living shell of regret. It's resting on a table, concealed beneath a white sheet. Murmurs circulate. His amused lordship whispers behind his hand to Fiduci, although you can still hear his respondent voice perfectly. You brought the box, didn't you? Fiduci snaps his fingers. Servants spring to attention. Meanwhile, the Bishop of St. Fiacres is stooping over the shell to examine its spiral patterns. He's about to touch it, but he thinks again. What is this? He asks. The coloration is all wrong. The implacable detective pins you in place with her eyes, like a butterfly skewered by needles on a board. Explain how you obtained it, he demands. You can tell them about our trip to Klein. You met the bishop's contact at the Citadel. You extracted the shell. You describe your operation on the Shrouded Man, while gloved servants lower the shell into a box. Fiduci hammers the box shut himself, driving massive nails into the wood. Couldn't even follow simple orders, mutters the unlikely florist. I hope this doesn't compromise the experiment. We should have sent someone else. But this is more entertaining, chortles his amused lordship. Variety might be the spice of life, but unexpected risk has its own piquancy, doesn't it? I wonder what else our friend still has to tell us. he says, winking at you. Yes, says the implacable detective. I wonder. We can tell them about the Youthful Naturalist. After all, he requested that you give the Dillman Club his regards. His amused lordship laughs and laughs and laughs. He smacks his knee. He almost chokes, and the woman in green helps him drink water from a tall glass. After he drains it, he wipes his lips and still keeps hiccuping as he giggles. This isn't good, says the implacable detective, ignoring the outburst. Before you joined us, that young man belonged to our club. Clever lad, his lordship manages to add between hiccups. Too clever, says the bishop with a mirthless grin. We revoked his membership, says Verducci, but apparently he's up to his old tricks. Can we discuss his history? What do they know about him? Why did they dismiss him from the club? It's better to leave certain hatchets buried, says the bishop. Suffice it to say that my contact in Klein was also his. We worked very well together at one point. I can't believe he got there first, says the amused lordship. Where in the world did he get the money? I swear that man never ceases to impress. His research diverged from our own, says the implacable detective. We accordingly cut his support. That's everything you need to know. He nods towards the servants, indicating that they should prepare to transport the box. This meeting is now adjourned. Okay, well, we can bring the meeting to a close. The implacable detective has made it very clear that this meeting is over. Your cooperation is appreciated, says the implacable detective. Our associate will attend to the shell. She indicates the unlikely florist who is directing the servants to load the box into a carriage outside. It may take time to see results. I would cultivate patience. Patience, says Verducci, finally selecting a fungal canapé. It's the only food anyone has touched. At this rate, you'll prolong your life just by waiting forever. If you want my advice... Your advice won't be necessary, says the implacable detective. Verducci sets the canapé back down. He doesn't say anything else. Soon enough, the group has disbanded. You're left with all the hors d'oeuvres and wine that nobody consumed. The servants clear the plates away. You sink into a chair. If you're inclined to ruminate, the Dillman Club has left you with a lot to ruminate upon. The Dillman Club has no further assignments for you now, but your association with radical academics will continue shortly. Prepare to stretch your Z-legs. The Dillman Club begun an experiment on the shell of regret, and we have 3 baskets of rubbery pies. Oh my god. And with that, I believe it is the end of the first part of Evolution. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but this is where I'm going to end the episode. So thank you very much for watching this. I enjoyed that a lot. That was awesome world building, and the Dillman Club is one of the more interesting parts of Fallen London to me. A secret club or a club of secrets. It's all very fun. So yes, thank you very much for watching. Please like, subscribe, let me know what you think. Your comments are greatly appreciated. And as always, see you next time.